Righto. I hope everybody can hear me okay. It's great to be there virtually. I'd love to be there in person, but I guess I save a few carbon emissions by doing this by video. It's been really cool to catch up and listen in on some of the discussion this morning. It's really a great meeting. And I think some of the things I've got to say might have been covered already in some of the other talks, but I think it doesn't hurt to hear some of these things more than once. So I'll just see if I can share my screen properly here. Just hang on a sec. Okay, so title of my presentation, dropping emissions, the who's, the how's and the why's. Well, I guess right now I know most about the why's, but yeah, I've been a climate change commissioner for a month now, and I guess it's my job along with the rest of the commission to get on to the who's and the how's this year. So I've got a few remarks about that now, and I think you've already heard some of the ideas about what do we actually do and who needs to do it. But anyway, we'll get into it and go through some of the why first, because that's sort of familiar territory for me at least. So starting off with a graph here of global carbon dioxide emissions in billions of tonnes going back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the 1750s. So, you can see there's a few blips, a few ups and downs, but mostly it's been growth. So emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have just gone up and up and up pretty much continuously, exponentially for a couple of 100 years. There are a few little blips, like the last one, 2008, a little blip down for a year. That was the global financial crisis. It reduced emissions very briefly, but they've been going up steadily since. So that's the annual emissions. If you add them up, you get the cumulative total emissions, and that looks like this. It's a much smoother curve, and it fits the exponential even better. So the total amount that humanity's emitted into the atmosphere has just gone up super fast, especially in the last 50 years or so. And we're just over 1,600 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide. So 1.6 trillion tonnes of carbon dioxide emitted since the 1750s. But most of it's been pretty recently. If you put this graph into percentage terms, so take the very last value, that 1,600, we call that 100%. This is what the curve looks like. And it's interesting, sort of frightening actually, to look at this and work out. So we've got 100% of emissions as of, this is actually 2018 is the last year on this plot. But if you look at, well, where do we fall 50%? And you look back and the 50% line comes in at 1990. So what that's saying is that half of the total emissions from human activity of carbon dioxide have happened in the last 30 years. So that's about the time that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and all the COP meetings, the discussions around reducing emissions have been in existence. And in that time, we've actually made the problem twice as bad as it was before. So yeah, the Climate Commission and equivalent bodies around the world are charged with the responsibility of finding a pathway to reducing emissions and getting to zero by 2050. But when you look at history, this is a massive ask, because things have just been rocketing upwards in the other direction for as long as we've got data, basically. So that's emissions. Great. Now we look at how much of this stuff's in the atmosphere, and this is a graph of the total amount of carbon dioxide, the concentration in the atmosphere, going back about 13,000 years. So most of the numbers here come from ice cores in Antarctica, two cores, the Law Dome and Taylor Dome. That's the red and the green part of the graph. And the blue are the direct measurements from Hawaii, the Mauna Loa Observatory. And the reason I show it like this is that, 10,000 years or so, that's the sort of timescale the Earth operates on. So the amount of time it takes a big ice sheet to melt, or the amount of time, well, maybe it's a bit longer than the deep ocean takes to adjust to some change, but the deep ocean works on 1,000-year timescales. And it's about how long that carbon dioxide would stay in the air. If we turn off the tap today, through the usual geological processes, that spike of carbon dioxide wouldn't come back down to where it was before for about the best part of 10,000 years. So we're locking in change for an incredibly long time already, unless we can work out technologies to remove this stuff out of the air. I know Greta Thunberg was saying in Davos just yesterday that, you know, these are non-existent technologies right now. We can't bank on being able to take carbon dioxide or other gases out of the air once we put them in there. So, you know, to fix this problem, we've got to turn off the tap now. And just to reiterate again, that business of the exponential rise in emissions, and, you know, half of the emissions have gone up in the last 30 years. So if you look at the rise in carbon dioxide in the air from 280 parts per million back in the 1600s through to the present, about 410 or a bit over now, half of the rise took about 230 years to happen. And the other half of the rise has taken about 30 years to happen. So again, you know, we've made this problem twice as bad as it was in the time that the world's governments have been talking about fixing it. So we need a major turnaround in the global economy, and really in thinking by the whole of humanity. And, you know, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but it's a big deal and we need to make big changes. So where we're at the moment, the concentration of CO2, other gases, methane, etc., the atmosphere we have today hasn't really been around for something like 3 million years or so. It's before humans evolved as a species, back in the mid-Pliocene. So we're already in a climate, we're already in an atmosphere that's different to anything humanity's experienced before. So it's, you know, no good looking to the past to see what's likely to happen in the future in some ways, because the past is no guide, or the past over the last few 100,000 years is no guide to what the future is going to look like. So anyway, you know, and we know that carbon dioxide and other gases, greenhouse gases in the air, warm the planet. They absorb heat that the Earth radiates. So of course, the Earth warms up, and we've just had the new global numbers come out just in the last few days. So here's a graph of temperatures globally, year by year, going back to 1880. This is from the NASA group in New York. Several groups do these analyses. They all get basically the same answer. And the numbers here on the vertical scale, the zero line is the average temperature before 1900. So the 20 years at the end of the 19th century, which is probably not far from the pre-industrial temperature. So we can see the last 5 years, including 2019, the year just gone, are all more than a degree above pre-industrial. And 2019 was the second warmest year on record, nearly 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial. The average at the moment is about 1.1 degrees above. And the Paris Agreement talks about stopping the warming at, you know, definitely less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial, and ideally only 1.5 degrees. And that's what the Zero Carbon Act is talking about, reducing emissions quickly enough to stop warming at 1.5 degrees, if every country did the same thing. And that's I guess that's the catch, and that's the caveat on that. So, okay, so that's what's happened. Rapid warming in the last few decades, especially. The rate of warming over the last 100 years, about 1 degree in a century. If you drew a straight line through the last 25 years, it's over 2 degrees per century. The rate of warming has gone up quite a lot in the last couple of decades. And you'd expect that because the rate of emissions of carbon dioxide has gone up in the last 2 or 3 decades. It's been going up constantly for many, many years. So you'd expect the rate of change to pick up. All right, so what about the future, and what about, you know, what do we do about it? Here's a graphic that, again, this is from one of the summaries of last year that just came out in the last few days. So the jerky lines there, the coloured lines, are various different groups, analyses of global temperatures, and one of them is the NASA, that's the greeny one, I think. And then the shading in the black line, that's the average of a bunch of climate models that are run for the IPCC reports. And these are from the last round of reports. And then the future is for a sort of middle of the road scenario for greenhouse gas emissions, not 1.5 degrees, but then not just do nothing, it's somewhere in between. So you can see the warming continues and then starts to flatten out towards the end of the century. Just to note though that these numbers are the vertical scale, you can see the numbers, they're kind of small. They're relative to the 1981 to 2010 average. So not pre-industrial, not the 19th century, but just the last few decades. And you've got to add about 0.6 of a degree to get comparable numbers to what I was showing before. So where it says 1 degree, it's actually 1.6, and where it says 0.5, it's 1.1, and that's about where we're at now. We've just crossed through 1.1 degrees, and you know, you can see the models, the average of the models, the black line follows the observations very closely. You know, obviously the ups and downs from one year to the next aren't picked up so much, that's in the shading, but the average is pretty spot on. So I think we can assume that that average line into the future is something like what we will see, unless we get on and really tackle the emissions. So you'd see 1.5 degrees of warming by about 2040, getting on to 2 degrees of warming by about 2060, and so on. And we know that if we get to those kinds of levels of warming, you know, the intensity of some of these extreme events, the sorts of things we're already seeing with the bushfires in Australia and massive flooding and all the rest of it, you know, they would start to become, we wouldn't be able to adapt to some of these changes. It would just be a bit too catastrophic. And last bit of data on what's going on. The change in temperature that we experience is important for us, but it's a really small part of the story. What's really important is how much heat's going into the ocean. So with all of our emissions of carbon dioxide and so on, a fraction of those gases are absorbed into the ocean, and that unfortunately makes the ocean water more acidic, so that's affecting marine life globally. But water is really good at absorbing heat, and it covers most of the globe, so it's absorbing most of the extra heat from greenhouse gas increase. And you see that in the rate of rise of ocean heat content. So the blue here is the light blue is the top 700 metres of the ocean, and the darker colour is from there down to 2,000 metres, which is about halfway down the ocean. So we're not including the very deep ocean in this calculation here with this graph. And we don't have such good numbers on the deeper ocean. It's taking a long time for the heat to get down there. But even the top half of the oceans are absorbing something like 90% of the heating that is warming the globe from greenhouse gas increase. So the atmosphere is only soaking up a couple of percent. And this is what locks in the change for centuries into the future. Okay, so enough on the problem, enough on the why, what's going on. So what do? How do we deal with this? Going back to that graphic of the carbon dioxide in the air, we've had this very rapid increase, especially in the last century or so, and we know that much carbon dioxide gives us about 1.1 degrees of warming. That's where we're at now compared to pre-industrial. And it's a pretty straightforward calculation. We know we've got the annual numbers on how much is being emitted globally. We know what concentration of carbon dioxide gives us a certain amount of warming. So how quickly will we get to the concentration that would give us 1.5 degrees or 2 or 3 or whatever? And this is where the idea of the climate emergency comes from. You know, at current emission rates will be enough of this carbon dioxide in the air to give us 1.5 degrees of warming within 10 years by 2030. It wouldn't happen in 2030 because the oceans are slowing things down, but it would happen by 2035 or so if we do nothing. Same story, 2 degrees of warming we'd have enough in the air within about 20 years. It would maybe take 25 years, so we're talking, you know, the mid-2040s to get to 2 degrees of warming. 3 degrees of warming, something like 50 years, maybe a little bit less than that, depending on how emissions go. But if we tackle emissions globally along the lines of the Zero Carbon Act, then we could still stop at 1.5 degrees of warming. So if we reduce emissions globally by half in the next 10 years and then get to zero by 2050, that adds up to about the same amount of extra carbon dioxide as just doing nothing at all for 10 years. So, that we have a lot of leverage at the moment, a lot of power. If the global community does start to really take this problem seriously and really start to reduce emissions, then, we can actually knock it on the head relatively quickly. I'm not saying 1.5 degrees of warming would be ideal. 1 degree of warming is already bad enough in a lot of ways, but it'd be an awful lot better than 2 or 3 degrees of warming. So it is possible, I think, and bodies like the Commission can actually play a good role in helping make this happen. All right, so getting on to the what and the how. So what do we do? Well, simple, just decarbonise the economy. Do that in New Zealand, do it around the world, and do it by 2050. End of story. So just sort that out, please. The sorts of things we're talking about here are, first of all, and this is a photograph of some wind turbines in New Zealand, just west of Wellington City, getting to 100% renewable electricity production. And for New Zealand, that's pretty straightforward. But then we're talking about 100% renewable energy production. We might be 80% renewable for electricity, but we're only about 45 or 50% renewable for total energy. There's a lot of fossil fuel burnt in transport, energy production, you name it. So we're talking about everything becoming driven by renewable sources, which is a much bigger problem. Changes to land use, basically less cows would be really good in a country like New Zealand. I'm sure you've heard about that today. I won't dwell on that too much, but that's certainly one of the things that we can do and we should be looking at pretty hard. And actually reducing waste. New Zealanders are great at reducing waste, and so we throw a lot away and that decomposes and releases methane and so on. Just being more careful, not consuming so much, not throwing so much away, not being so wasteful with energy, all of these things add up to quite significant savings in emissions and in energy use, so the need for production of energy. And if we're really thinking broadly about sustainability and our society going on for centuries into the future, we really can't have growth in anything, not just in greenhouse gases or energy use. We've got to stop all forms of growth, even economic growth, right? So if we're going to have a circular economy or a donut economy like Tairāwhiti in the UK talks about, it's a picture from the cover of one of her books, we cannot afford to grow. We've got to find a way to stabilise things and just have resources go round and around a lot more. You can't completely reuse everything all the time, but you can get pretty close to that if you try. And we need to move away from this growth paradigm completely, really, and get towards a much more repurposing, reusing, recycling kind of mentality across the whole globe. And to me, what we're talking about here really is, well, it's taking responsibility for the problem. We're causing this problem. We're the ones putting this stuff in the air. We really need to walk the talk on fixing it. Now, there has been an awful lot of talk in the last 25 or 30 years, especially about, yes, we're going to get onto it, but we've been doing the opposite in reality. And the global economy is growing hugely, and global emissions of greenhouse gases have grown hugely. And to me, it really comes back to the principles of Mātauranga Māori that, we're talking about humanity being a part of the ecosystem, a part of the land. We don't own the land, we're not on the land, we're of the land. And I think the audience I'm talking to today know this way better than I do. We're really talking about a decolonisation mentality, not some sort of dominion thing. We don't just come in, strip the resources, use them and throw the waste away into the air or wherever and just carry on. Eventually that comes to bite you in the bum, and we do have to accept that we are part of a bigger ecosystem. We are part of the world, we're part of the land, and we need to act like it, and we need to find ways to operate where we're not just constantly strip mining and slashing and burning and moving on to the next bit of resource. We have to start reusing. So that's a bit of philosophy anyway. So how do we go about this? Well, yeah, agriculture accounts for nearly half of New Zealand's emissions in terms of total amount of gases. And methane is one of the big ones. And these guys mostly burp this stuff out. It's not actually, we're not talking about a fart tax, we're talking more about a burp tax. But also nitrous oxide is a big greenhouse gas from the agriculture sector. And that's both from nitrogen-based fertilisers, but also from waste, cow poo and urine release quite a lot of nitrogenous compounds. But the way the Zero Carbon Act is worded, agriculture, and there's an awful lot of argument about this, but agriculture basically is not hammered as hard as carbon dioxide emissions. So we have big agricultural emissions, but mostly these are short lifetime gases, i.e. methane, which stays in the air for maybe 10, 15 years, whereas carbon dioxide is there for hundreds of years. So ultimately how much change we get depends on how much carbon dioxide and not so much on how much methane. If we turned off the methane tap, the emissions would drop away very, very quickly. So that means it's less of a drama, it's less important to reduce the methane emissions very, very quickly. There's other reasons why we might want to reduce the stocking rates for dairy cows and so on, which are unrelated to climate change. But from a climate change point of view, it's carbon dioxide emissions that are the real pillar. And it's where the biggest growth in emissions has come from in New Zealand in the last 30 years. So one of the big deals in New Zealand is actually transport. So transport emissions have grown, they've nearly doubled, I think, since 1990. And getting on top of that problem, I think, is something that we can tackle. There are some fairly obvious things New Zealand as a country can do and what the government can do, moving much more quickly to electric vehicles, pumping up public transport, getting back into rail instead of road freight. All these things are on the table, I think, or at least being talked about. And I think we can reduce emissions there, hopefully quite quickly. And it's a really important sector to tackle. And the other one is industrial energy production. It's a picture of the Huntly Power Station, but quite a lot of carbon dioxide emissions comes from energy production for industrial use. And, an example, I suppose, is a coal-fired boiler that Fonterra might use to create milk powder from milk. And we really, again, need to move away from that kind of fossil fuel use for heating or for energy production industry. And there are well-known solutions there. Basically, we can move quite quickly to solar and to other forms of renewable energy production. So carbon dioxide really is the main event. The sooner we can reduce the carbon dioxide, the sooner we can stop the warming. And the sooner, actually, as you do that, the methane emissions and the other things do become relatively more important. But once we've got on top of the carbon dioxide emissions, that's when we really start to have to nail methane and so on. But getting carbon dioxide first is really where we want to be. All right, so for New Zealand, I've got some numbers here, and these are from a report that was produced 5 years or so ago now, so a little bit out of date, but the concepts are still the same, the relative numbers are still basically the same. So if New Zealand did become 100% renewable in electricity, then the numbers here are from our 2015 national emissions. We've reduced about 5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions for that last 20% of electricity production, and thinking we would really like to get to way more than 100% renewable, because we'll be ramping up the use of electricity if we're bringing in all these electric vehicles and so on. So yeah, changes in transport, I've already mentioned this, so incentivising electric vehicle uptake. Basically, electric cars are expensive, but they don't have to be so expensive. The government chose to subsidise both the vehicles themselves and the infrastructure to charge them up, and we could ramp that up quite quickly. Much more investment in public transport. I take one of these vehicles here on the left, the commuter trains in Wellington. They're powered by electricity, most of which is renewable, very reliable service, but not completely reliable. It doesn't work for everybody. We could be putting a lot more into really good quality public transport and actually saving people from having to drive their car, whether it's electric or petrol or whatever. And yeah, rail generally, using rail for freight rather than the road, is well known to reduce overall carbon dioxide emissions. Yep, already mentioned this one too. So reducing the amount of fossil energy used for energy production in industry, that would save something like 6 megatons, 6 million tonnes of emissions. This is 2015 values. Reducing waste, that's if we halve the amount of waste New Zealand produced, that would save another 3 or 4 megatons. Do interesting things to agricultural ruminant animals, put balloons on the back of the cows and float them away to South America would be one solution. But these measurements of the gases these animals produce have been really useful in helping us understand just what the emissions are from agricultural animal farming. And it was a wonderful little korero about plant-based diets we heard just before, and I absolutely endorse that. But certainly eating less red meat is a great thing to be doing, maybe, and eating no meat at all is the way a lot of people are going, and that definitely reduces emissions overall. But there are already things that can be done with feed and just a bit of destocking that would maybe save a couple of megatons per year in agricultural emissions, and just being smarter with how fertiliser is applied. Quite a bunch of things that could be being done there. And one that's become a reality already, planting a lot of trees. The Billion Trees program is underway. And as trees grow, they do absorb carbon dioxide. So they are a sink of emissions. And if we grow a lot of trees, that again is estimated to maybe save us another 3 or 4 million tonnes of emissions per year. So all of those things that were calculated a few years ago added up to roughly a 40% reduction in emissions in 15 years' time, from 2015 to 2030. So, and that's without trying terrifically hard. So I think we could get a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, even from now, if we really applied ourselves to this problem. So there's some quite well-known things we can be doing up front to really start to reduce emissions. Getting the last bit of the emissions down, that's always the hardest part. But we can get halfway there, I would say. It's not going to be easy, but we can see a pretty clear pathway to that right now. Just to mention the Billion Trees program, this is a graphic from the Ministry of Forestry website. This is as of just a few weeks ago, and actually I looked back at this website about 3 or 4 months ago. The numbers haven't actually changed very much. Sort of started off with a hiss and a roar. Things have slowed down a bit at the moment, but still about 150 million trees have already been planted, and there's 83 million seedlings last year, and this is a reasonably definite number. Exactly where that's going this year, I'm not entirely sure, but there is this philosophy that goes along with this, the slogan, the right tree, the right place, the right purpose. And this is really important. There's a little, in the infographic there down the bottom, it says 12% native, 88% exotic. What the mix of native and exotic species should be, I think, still being worked through. And there's no particular right answer there, but whereabouts trees are being grown, and what is the wood going to be used for? And we need to think about things like pest species. As the climate warms, the mix of pests is changing, and the risk of forest fires is going up. Don't need to tell people in Australia about that, but in New Zealand as well, in the drier parts of the country, the East Coast especially, forest fire danger is expected to double or maybe even triple in some parts of the eastern regions of the country this century. And that's with a sort of, again, middle of the road warming scenario. So we need to be careful about where the trees are planted and what we're doing to add to fire danger. Are we exposing ourselves to pests? And thinking longer term, is it better to have slower growing native species or exotics that grow more quickly and pull more carbon dioxide out of the air faster, and so on. So getting underway is really good, but we do need to be a bit careful about where it goes from here. All right, so who's going to do this? Who reduces emissions? Well, ultimately it's everybody. Everyone has a role to play, and everyone can do something, you know. And I've said there, anything that makes a difference makes a difference. Meaning, all of us, if we take public transport more, drive less, fly less, ride our bicycles more, if that's what we do, make the clothes we wear last a bit longer, so less of the sort of fast fashion throwaway culture, all of those things do make a difference to our own personal carbon footprints. And that's useful, you know, that's important. But I think one of the best things we can do is have this kind of korero today, you know, talk about the problem, make it acceptable, make it normal to talk about climate change. You know, it is the biggest problem that we've ever faced as a species, and yet it gets swept under the rug a lot of the time. People talk a lot more about the cricket or, I don't know, Meghan and Harry than they do about climate change. We should be able to just talk about what's happening with the climate and what we're doing about it, just normally, you know, down at the pub or in the tea room at work. It should become much more normal to just hear about it and think about what we're doing, and to hopefully feel empowered about making some change, because that's the hardest part of it. If it seems overwhelming, then you feel overwhelmed and you don't really do anything. So I think, you know, this comes into the scale of the problem. This is not going to be solved by us all taking public transport and riding our bicycles. You know, the whole of the global economy has to change. So it's a society-wide issue, and governments really set the tone for a national economy. They set the rules that big businesses operate under. So governments can legislate and set price signals and, you know, push things around and steer businesses in the right direction. So governments are the ones that really have to take a lead on this. Sure, we can all do our own thing, but the national scale has to be a big part of the solution, or we're just not going to get there. So really, I think one of the biggest roles that all of us can play is to just help the government see what to do, you know, help to steer the government in the right direction so they can set the rules to get business doing the right things and all that. So, you know, talking about the problem, but talking in a politically active kind of way. You know, my role on the commission, it's my job to tell the government what they could be doing. But I think all of us as citizens can play that role. So, you know, this fantastic photograph taken at Parliament a few months ago at the climate march, thousands of people turned up on the lawn at Parliament buildings and made a noise about climate change. And I think that's just wonderful, and it's something all of us can do, whether it's doing something like this, actually showing up on a march, or just sending an email to your MP, putting something on Facebook, you know, anything at all, anything that advances the conversation, I think actually helps that conversation. Anyway, I might just wrap up with a few words about the Commission. So officially the Climate Change Commission, there was an interim Climate Change Committee that ran last year, which did some very nice work sort of getting things started. But the Commission itself has only officially been in existence for 1 month. So we've had one meeting and we sort of all starting to get to know each other. But the first real meeting was on Friday of this week. So just in a couple of days, and we're going to start getting stuck into it from the end of this week. And what the Commission is set up to do is to advise government on emissions reductions. So, you know, setting the scene for what might happen at a government level. And the way it operates is through 5-year budgets. That is, over the next 5 years, where should we be in different sectors with total emissions of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. So the task this year is to develop the first one of these budgets. And it has to be delivered to the government by the 1st of February of next year, so pretty much 1 year away from now. And really, the aim is to get a draft budget down within the next 6 months or so. So there's a lot to do really short term. Should be interesting. The exact form of what this takes, you know, is yet to be decided. We haven't quite got on to the detail at that level, but it's going to have to involve sectoral targets for reduced emissions. So, you know, different sectors of the economy and society, where should we be in total with emissions in the next 5 years? And really, we should be providing advice to the government about how to go about this. You know, should they be incentivising electric vehicles, and how much new generation capacity should be being invested in, and how is it going to operate with, you know, public-private partnerships, etc., etc. There's a lot of some interesting social science and economics and so on built into all of that. And one of the really exciting things from my point of view is that there's quite a major program of engagement starting up. So through this year, there'll be hui around the country and opportunities for individuals, businesses, community groups, you name it, to have in, you know, so the idea is not to just get in some closed room somewhere and just talk amongst ourselves. It's very much conversation with the whole of the country about how we move forward. So the idea is to hear from as many people as possible. And there's also sort of an educational aspect to this. I'm not quite sure how that's going to play out, but it's certainly seen that the Commission could facilitate a broader conversation in society in New Zealand and help to educate about what's happening with climate change and what's going on with the solutions. You know, the key word I said earlier on the slide is advise. So the Commission's set up to advise the government. And a lot of people submitted when submissions were open last year on how the Commission should operate, including myself, said, you know, that the Commission should have teeth, should be able to actually tell government what to do and actually force things to happen. That's not the way it's happened. It's not the way it's played out. So it's this advisory role. So it'll be very interesting to see how that's going to work in practice and how much advice the government will actually take and how that might change as governments change. And of course, it's an election year this year. So it'll be very interesting to see this year what the messages are from the different parties around how they're going to work with the Commission and what they're really going to do. Okay, so if New Zealand does actually achieve 100% reductions in emissions by 2050, that would be absolutely awesome. But as some people I can think of like to say often, New Zealand only produces 0.2% of the global total emissions. So who cares what happens here? And if New Zealand was the only country that acted, it really would be, yeah, very bad news. But, you know, all countries have to do their part. New Zealand, per head of population, is in the top 10 of emitters. It only happens there are not many people in New Zealand, so we look kind of cleaner and greener than we really are. And New Zealand surely is very well placed to become a zero carbon economy. It's a small economy, it's a small population, we can move quickly. We already have 80% renewable electricity. We've got untold amounts of power out there, plenty of sun, plenty of wind, plenty of wave power, all sorts of things. So surely New Zealand can do this thing. And I think New Zealand really has an opportunity to lead in this area, to inspire other countries, at least to help other countries. We need to export what we do, whether that's the work of the Commission or the legislative framework from government or the technologies we use and the way government and businesses work together. All the things we need to do to get to zero carbon can be copied or adapted or talked about overseas. And this is something we've had a preliminary discussion about in our one Commission meeting we've had so far. And it's recognised that, yeah, if this is going to be useful for the world, we've got to export what we're doing around the world. And hopefully the countries, the small emitting countries, if they get together, you know, we can make a real difference to the world ourselves and hopefully pressure or help or inspire, whatever, get the big emitters to do the same. So if we can make a difference for China or the US or India or Brazil, that would be fantastic. So I think, you know, New Zealand does get noticed internationally, and we have historically had a really high profile on the international stage in all sorts of ways. So I think we should use that soft power that we have in international platforms and help push or lead or inspire other countries to get us where we need to go. Okay, so the climate's already changed and it will continue to change for a long time yet, and we're entering, or maybe we're already in, a climate that we haven't really seen globally for thousands of years. And everything is changing. You know, the climate is where we live. It's everything around us. So it's sea level rise, ocean acidification, temperature, rainfall, heat waves, and its ecosystems, you know, species extinctions, changes in agriculture. Pretty much everything you can think of is changing as we speak. So we need to adapt, we need to plan for it, we need to be flexible and responsive, do that now and think long-term in the future as well. But I think the big message here, and I suppose the point of having a commission and so on, is that what the future looks like depends on our actions, depends on how much more of this crap we put in the atmosphere. The greater the warming, the more damage done. So the more time we allow to pass before we really tackle the problem, the bigger the changes, the more damaging the changes, the harder they are to deal with, and the more grief there's going to be down the track. But really, the bottom line here is the sooner we stop emitting greenhouse gases, the sooner we stop climate change. Sure, there are feedbacks in the system, and there's the Arctic permafrost and all the rest of it. But all of that's being driven by human emissions of greenhouse gases. So if we just turn off that tap pretty quickly, we will actually stop the climate from changing. So we have, again, an awful lot of power. And I would really love to see us use it for good. So thank you very much.